Good morning. My name is Kristen Nelson. I'll be moderating the panel today, and you are at the Influence of Classic Monsters. So I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, and then they'll come up one by one for their presentations. Kazim from the University of California, San Diego, Making America Monstrous Again, Queerness and Community in Frankenstein. Kazim's most recent book, Black Buffalo Woman, An Introduction to the Poetry and Poetics of Lucille Clifton, won the Poetry Foundation's Pegasus Award for Poetry Criticism. He is a professor of comparative literature and literary arts in the Department of Literature at the University of California, San Diego. David Crespy, University of Missouri, The Missouri Horror, A Monster of Lynching. David Crespy founded University of Missouri's Writing for Performance program and serves as its co-director. He is the founding artistic director of the university's Missouri Playwrights Workshop, the Mizzou New Play Series, and Summer Reps Comedies in Concert Series. Areas of research include playwriting, screenwriting, acting, dramatic literature, and theater history. His most recent book is Dream Writing, Dream Work for Dramatic Writing for Stage and Screen. And our third panelist will be Brandon Callender, Brandeis University, Desiring Disposability in Black and Queer Vampire Fiction. Brandon Callender received his PhD in English from the University of California, Berkeley in 2020, and is currently an assistant professor of English at Brandeis University. His research explores the intersections of Black studies, queer theory, and horror. His courses include The Ghosts of Race, Blackness and Horror, and Vampires, Dark Fictions of Blood. Callender has appeared as an expert guest on NPR's 1A and has served as a recurring discussant at the Brattle Theater. His essays have appeared in The Bigness of Things and Qui Parle, and his forthcoming book, Getting Behind in Black Gay Men's Literature, is under contract with the Ohio State University Press. So to start us off, if you would please help me to welcome Kazim, and we'll do questions after all of the panelists have presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. This is a very bad idea, that what I'm doing right now, but hopefully that cup is going to get progressively emptier and it will be less dangerous as we go. We're going to stick to our time so we can have Q&A. So if I hit, thank you. If I hit the time and I'm still chattering, just start clap, just cut me off, yeah. Okay. Barbara Johnson calls the central transgression of Frankenstein a, quote, desire for resemblance. This might be thought of as queer. Anais Nin, a lay analyst and student of Freud's disciple Otto Rank, once suggested that homosexuality might be a personality disorder akin to narcissism, that one wanted to love in the other what one desired in the self. If Nin's pathologizing has aged badly, in Frankenstein there is no denying Robert Walton's attraction to Victor. Walton refers to himself in letters to his sister Margaret as romantic, quote unquote romantic, when he confesses to his sister how bitterly he feels for want of a friend. As an autodidact and reasonably well-read in the poetry of the day, Walton is keenly aware of the chances he has missed to find kinship. In fact, he longs after the local men of the town with their, quote, rugged bosoms, and laments that the gentle and feminine fosterage of Margaret herself has so refined the groundwork of my character that I cannot overcome an intense distaste to the usual brutality exercised on board ship. Victor also desires resemblance. He seems to reject the creature based on its lack of resemblance to its creator, and the creature seeks to assuage his own loneliness by attaining the type of heteronormative couplings that he sees in the world around him. And of course, Victor later on in the book, one of the reasons he refuses to build the bride for the creature is because he's afraid that the bride will see him first, and he's so handsome that the bride will fall in love with him and reject the creature. It is not difficult, it is not overly difficult to queer Robert Walton. He himself spells out the ways he feels alienated from both sexuality and gender roles assigned him not only by the broader society left behind, but by the heterotopic society of the ship itself, the apex of which he, as captain, sits. But by now, it is no fun arguing about whether or not Victor is gay-coded. Countless film adaptations have picked up on the gay vibe, including the iconic 1931 film adaptation starring the floopy-haired and fetching Colin Clive, long rumored to have been bisexual. And Michael E. Sinatra does trace queer representation in 4 film adaptations, among which he includes Rocky Horror Picture Show, but does not include Bill Condon's 1998 Gods and Monsters, featuring James Whale, the director of the Frankenstein films, longing after his hunky but hapless gardener Clayton Boone, who was played by Brendan Fraser. At any rate, America is the monster of the moment. The United States of America's creation, by exploiting enslaved labor and dispossession of indigenous peoples, was followed by a continuous requirement of cheap labor of immigrant communities from Europe and Asia to support the wealth of an oligarchic class. Its current migrant crisis was exacerbated by a century of racist foreign policy, yet its current food supply system depends on that undocumented labor. Any monster, whether it's Victor or the creature that is more monstrous, it depends on how you apply the analogy, needs its victims to understand without question its side of the story. So as town halls across the country explode, it seems like the American polity and the oligarchs who sit in the seats of power are engaged in just such a struggle as consumed Victor and his creature, which is a struggle over the narrative of the story, who tells the story and how they tell it. Elizabeth Young, in Black Frankenstein, The Making of an American Metaphor, posits Frankenstein as a uniquely American story, citing the 3 hallmarks of this Frankenstein, of a Frankenstein story, which is amalgamation, reanimation, and revolt. She further argues that Frankenstein is a Black American story akin to the revisions of The Tempest, though unlike Caliban, who has a claim to the island through his mother, the creature in Frankenstein is completely dispossessed. And first, he attempts to apply logic and reason in his dealings with Victor in the mountains above the village of Chamonix, but only when logic and reason fail to attain his goals does he embrace terror as his only real power. Monstrous America is not a monolith, of course, and dissenters do show some signs of stirring, and we're witnessing that unfolding on the news every day, honestly. There is a romance between perceived power and the perceiver. The autodidact Robert Walton is fully enamored of the feverish and sickly man he has rescued from the frigid sea. In a real sense, at the moment, Robert Walton is all of us, listening to the insane story of a man rescued from a drifting ice floe in the polar north, a story which includes the story of the created being, which in its turn contains the story of an immigrant family, a refugee family fleeing France, the de Lacys. And by extension, the story at the heart of the nest of layers is the story of Safiye, the Christian Arab and Turkish Muslim, and her father, who have come to Switzerland from an unsafe place beyond its borders. So that's interesting to me, actually, that there is a Muslim refugee at the heart of the story of Frankenstein. Let us skip over the animation of the creature. After all, Mary Shelley nearly does herself. But I am interested to think that when the creature is created and he peeks in through the bedclothes, Victor runs away because in the book he finds the creature ugly. That's why he runs away. It's really interesting to me. It's not an ethical dilemma. It's not he's horrified because he created life. It's not some metaphysical concern. I mean, he literally thinks the face looking at him is ugly, and he freaks out and he runs away. And he doesn't run away to do anything interesting. He paces the courtyard, then he falls into a fever, then he goes camping for about 4 months. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. He hikes a lot in this book, and he sleeps a lot in the book. And sometimes he sleeps while he's hiking. He falls asleep in the bottom of a boat drifting on water twice in this book. Twice. And that is why probably nearly every film adaptation has had to radically rewrite or compress its excellent story. He finally goes home. Nearly 6 months pass before Victor receives a letter from his father with the information that his younger son, William, has been murdered. He does have another brother, Ernst, who does not really figure in the story very much. He's pretty, but he's dumb. And he is the only Frankenstein to survive the book, interestingly enough. Though at first Victor rushes home, he's paralyzed with grief and lingers in Lausanne for 2 more days before continuing on. He arrives in Geneva too late, the gates have been locked, and he must stay in the village outside the walls. And that evening, in stormy light, he spies his creature in the rocks and is convinced that the creature is the one responsible for murdering William, a crime for which the maid in the house, Justine Moritz, is accused. So let's talk briefly about the Frankensteins themselves. Justine's trial is brief. She speaks in her own defense, explaining she was away the night William was missing and slept during her attempts to find him. Elizabeth, so she is a stepdaughter in the house. Justine is not a stepdaughter. She's been adopted into the house. And Elizabeth is the other girl who was adopted into the house. Elizabeth's family was wealthy, so she's adopted as a family member. Justine's mother was a working woman, so she's brought into the house, but as Elizabeth's maid. So it's not really an inclusive adoptive situation. Even though Elizabeth speaks eloquently on her behalf, it comes to naught. Justine is found guilty. And to add insult to injury, after she is found guilty, Justine actually confesses to the crime. Although she later explains to Victor and Elizabeth that during the night, the confessor had been berating her so much that, quote, I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. So in this case, we have a perfectly criminal, not a criminal who did not kill the boy, because we, the readers, know that the creature killed the boy because we've seen the scene of it. Nobody else knows, and yet she believes that she is that she did do it. Since her prior declarations of guilt are thus compromised, one can nearly see a parallel between Justine and the creature, both confused, both acting from instinct. And the one person who knows the truth, Victor, does not say a word, does not even try to explain, though he could have said he had seen a strange man in the mountains a day earlier. Then again, he did let 6 months pass without mentioning to a sole person what he had done in the laboratory that dreary night of November, not even his mentor, Kremp, who might have believed him. Of course, Victor doesn't like Kremp, possibly because the man is physically unattractive. Victor has described him as squat and repulsive. So in the end, it's a frame-up of both Justine and the creature. We will hear the creature's whole side of it soon enough, but for now let us observe, like the actual creation scene, the language describing the creature's encounter with William is vague. After being hounded out of a village where he'd been hiding in the interim months, the creature is sleeping in the fields outside of Geneva when he is woken by William passing by, describing him as a beautiful child who is perhaps unprejudiced to the horror of deformity. The creature thought he might educate him as my companion and friend. It does not go well. William covers his eyes and screams. The creature begs the boy to listen and even says, I do not intend to hurt you. But William is in his high brat phase and hurls curses at him and even invokes his father's political power in the town. While the boy, quote, loaded me with epithets, the creature explains, I grasped his throat to silence him, and in a moment he lay dead at my feet. Of course, there is no question that the creature is glad that William is dead, but it is just it is unclear whether or not he intended to kill him. The ambiguity in language and circumstance around William's actual death is compounded by one other niggling problem. There is no real reason for either Victor or any other reasonable reader to be so firm in the knowledge that Justine didn't kill William. We only ever know anything about Justine through a letter sent by Elizabeth to Victor, and it is a very weird letter. She recounts Justine's history to Victor as if he didn't know her. She reminds him how Justine came to the family and even about some of the things that she and he have said to each other. It is fair enough, Victor has been away for almost 7 years, but the truth is Justine is a cipher. It's entirely reasonable that, having been brought into a wealthy family to be a maid and governess, her motivations for the murder were exactly as the prosecutors explained: jealousy. She does behave extremely suspiciously and has no real explanations for her actions during her interrogation, attempting to acquit herself in a composed manner only later at the trial itself. And then, of course, there is the matter of her confession, one she claims was given out of just desperation, but which still makes no actual sense. Yes, of course, the creature later tells Victor that it was he that committed the crime, but at that point, we have already heard one false confession. Why shouldn't there be another? Let's go back to how the creature learned how to speak in the first place. In absence of Victor's care and responsibility, he has learned for himself language, but also the norms and manners of human society. He learned about prejudice and tenderness. He has even learned about love. He did not learn to be human from Victor, but from the immigrant family living in the cottage that he comes across in the wilderness. He somehow hides in a little hovel on the property and remains unnoticed by them for months. Let's let that pass. The creature observes the DeLacys living a very humble life. It is the brother and sister, Agatha, who keeps house and takes care of their father, the old man, who, now the DeLacys don't make it into any of the film adaptations. The old man who's blind usually does. He's usually in there. And then Felix, the brother, departs each day, presumably to work. While the creature takes great pleasure in imagining himself as part of the family, doing chores, surreptitiously chopping wood at night and adding to the family stores, by morning, he does not present himself, staying somehow invisible and unknown to the family. The creature notices they were not entirely happy. They often went apart and appeared to weep. He comes to understand that poverty is an evil, and he calls it an evil, and is one of the reasons for the family's sadness. It's in these months, the full season of winter, that the creature begins to understand the basics of the language as Felix and Agatha speak to each other. He also begins to understand tenderness, sympathy, and joy. Was skipping over that a little bit. Okay. Patricia Matthew in A Demon I Had Myself Created, Race, Frankenstein, and Monstering picks up on Elizabeth Young's notion of Frankenstein as a Black American story and frames the creature as Black. Written in the aftermath of and in response to the court proceedings of the police officer who shot and killed Michael Brown in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, her essay suggests that the original readers of the knowledge would have read it in the context of the 1807 law abolishing the slave trade and the debate raging in England at the time over the institution of slavery itself, which was finally outlawed in 1833, 2 years after Shelley's revision of Frankenstein was published, the version that is most familiar to readers today. Matthews draws analogies between the creature's time living near the DeLacys, learning to read and beginning to understand the social structure of family and work, and the narratives of Frederick Douglass and Olaudah Equiano, analogies that would have been clearly understood by the first readers of Frankenstein. There is a reason why the DeLacys are sad. Formerly wealthy Parisians, they have lost everything because they tried to help an immigrant family wrongly oppressed by the French judicial and carceral systems. Safier's father, a wealthy merchant from Turkey, has been wrongly accused of a crime and imprisoned, and his case attracted Felix's interest, who as a young idealist feels committed to helping his Muslim neighbor. The merchant, though innocent of the crimes for which he was jailed, is nonetheless a devious fellow, and he facilitates the introduction of Felix to his daughter and encourages Felix's belief that he will allow them to marry upon his liberation. Though Felix goes to great pains, the merchant has no intention of allowing Safiya to marry the now bankrupt Felix DeLacy and intends the girl to return with him to Turkey. It seems a little surprising to suddenly, in the middle of a murderous horror story, have a pastoral tale of an immigrant refugee family with a little romance and political intrigue thrown in, but one can think back to Barbara Johnson's contention that the novel really does interrogate family structures. Most families in Frankenstein are not the normative nuclear kind. They often, as previously mentioned, are missing a parent or include others not biologically related. Besides the Frankensteins, in which the two adopted daughters are added, you have the de Lacys and Safier, and Victor and his shunned creatures, as well as two chummy domestic and perhaps platonic couples, the bromantic couple of Victor and Henry, and the slightly more passionate couple of Victor and Robert in the Northern Seas. It's also worth saying that nobody in this book has a mother. Everyone's mother is dead or soon to be. The only person in the novel who has a mother is Henry, the best friend, but she's just mentioned. She doesn't appear in the book, just that he has one. Safier's political awakening mirrors Mary Shelley's own upbringing. Mary Wollstonecraft's argument in A Vindication of the Rights of Women might today be considered a conservative argument. By equal access to education, women will contribute better to society and be more effective wives and mothers. It's not a human rights argument, but a pragmatic social one. And Safier, on the run with her father, realizes that even being a criminal in revolutionary France would be better, or a fugitive in Germany, would be better than life in gender-exclusive social spaces back in Turkey. So when her father leaves to attend to some business, she makes a break for it. So let me quickly say, I'll close up with a couple of last comments because I want to keep to my time. Safier's letters to Felix form an important part of Frankenstein's DNA. They make her the fourth narrator of the book, even though we, the reader, never read her text. This is an argument made by Joyce Zenona. Zenona finds it significant that though Safier's letters reinforce the authenticity of the tale for both Victor and Robert, we do not learn their contents except for them being by described. As much as she may be a stand-in for Mary Wollstonecraft, in Mary Wollstonecraft's book, she uses the gender politics of the Muslim world to argue for greater liberality of thought in Europe. It might be thought of as an unintentionally racist argument, but one can see a parallel between Safier and the creature, for each hopes to create a life for themselves beyond what the larger society they have been born into. And they read these books, telling books. They read Volney's Ruin of Empires. The creature once more empathizes with the Arab refugee, saying that he, quote, wept with Safier over the fate of the original inhabitants of the American hemisphere, meaning the indigenous people. It's far more empathy than Victor has for anyone in the Americas, when the creature tells him later that if Victor builds him a bride, they'll go to South America to live, and Victor thinks he's chosen South America because it is, quote, a desert. South America was quite populated at the time that Frankenstein was published, at any rate. Emboldened by his observations of the love between Felix and Safier and haunted by his own suicidal thoughts after the reading of The Sorrows of Young Werther, the creature decides he has to take a chance at making a contact with the adopted family. It does not go well. It is a harbinger of things to come. The creature's constant, desperate desire to be loved and accepted has evolved now into a declaration of everlasting war against all humans. Even after this moment, after wandering in the Swiss mountains, he thinks of those he considers friends and, quote, the mild voice of de Lacy, the gentle eyes of Agatha, and the exquisite beauty of the Arabian, and it causes him to weep. As spring arrives, he is, quote, cheered by the loveliness of its sunshine and the balminess of the air, and raises his eyes, quote, with thankfulness towards the blessed sun. It is the closest anyone in this book about people with God complexes gets to actually praying. But he is not admitted to human society. The creature, thus bitterly rejected, now knows that humans will never accept him, no matter what he says or does. He still wishes somehow to create a society for himself, some friends and loved ones, and that desire alone proves he is not monstrous. Thank you.
I apologize. I'm fairly new to the world of monsters. However, I wrote a play that borrows from Lovecraft, which I will be discussing. When I began writing the Missouri Horror, it was in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests at the University of Missouri, where I teach, in 2015. And I, trying to make sense of that moment, used the tools I have as a dramatist to combat the hate and bigotry that surrounded the reaction to that event. I had known of the lynching of James Scott in 1923 in Columbia, Missouri, the subject of the play, since before I came to Mizzou in 1998. It was a story that gave me pause, as I wasn't sure back then, as an East Coast Jew, if I wanted to live in a town where this incident occurred. Still, I found myself, years later, a theater professor at Mizzou, busy writing plays, directing, and acting, in the midst of this crisis moment, in the chaos of that fraught moment of racism, as our football players refused to play, our legislature cut our funding, our faculty and staff lost their jobs, and our students protested what was to be one of the darker moments in my experience living in Columbia. During that time, I was asked by the Association of Black Graduate and Professional Students at the University of Missouri to write a piece for a presentation they wanted to make in support of the students who were trying to pick up the pieces after the Black Lives Matter protests came apart with the resignations of our then UM system president, Tim Wolfe, and University of Columbia Chancellor R. Bowen Lofton. This was the moment I wrote the Missouri Horror. As I investigated the history of the lynching, I discovered the excellent research of the University of Missouri Professor Douglas Hunt and an undergraduate, Patrick J. Huber, who were themselves documenting the work of Charles Nutter, who was a journalism student at the University of Missouri. Nutter witnessed James Scott as he was pulled from his jail cell and dragged to his death on Stewart Bridge. Hunt went on to write a wonderful history of the incident in his book, Summary Justice, the lynching of James Scott and the trial of George Barkwell in Columbia, Missouri, 1923, and his research really affected my ideas about how I should write this play. It had to be a docudrama based on the facts, but tinted by the horrific details of how a community transformed into a skulking, slithering, hideous beast. What struck me initially was the sheer size of the event. Over 1,000 people attended, which was a large portion of the town's population then, of about 15,000, and of that group, many were students. This led W.E.B. Du Bois to write a blistering satire entitled A University Course in Lynching, in which he noted with sarcasm, "We are glad to note that the University of Missouri has opened a new course in applied lynching. Many of our American universities have long defended the institution, but they have not been frank or brave enough, actually, to arrange a mob murder so that students could see it." And he added, "We are very much in favor of this method of teaching 100% Americanism. As long as mob murder is an approved institution in the United States, students at university should have a first-hand chance to judge exactly what a lynching is." What fascinated and horrified me the most was the reaction of the crowd and how the mob mentality worked, as it was unstoppable, unrelenting, fed on lies, needing to consume. The actual events of the crime which led to the lynching were cryptic and poorly documented. What had occurred was that Regina Olmsted, a teenage daughter of a German literature professor, Hermann Olmsted, was allegedly raped by James Scott, a 35-year-old janitor at the university. However, Olmsted confronted the mob as they dragged Scott down the street to the Stewart Bridge, where Scott was eventually murdered, and begged them to stop. However, the mob threatened to murder him as well, and so he backed off. And with that, the lynching proceeded with no other attempts to stop it. How had that crowd been whipped into such a frenzy? It didn't take much. The local newspaper, the Columbia Tribune, which exists today, provided exactly the right fuel and fervor to feed what I felt was the transformation of human beings into a kind of monstrous single entity, a mob hungry for murder, for revenge, feeding on hate, bigotry, and ignorance. Once I understood where my focus would be, I turned to the work of H.P. Lovecraft to give me a structural dramaturgy with which to build the play and the monster of the mob. To get there, I had to look at the nature of Lovecraft's most famous monsters, including Cthulhu, a giant octopus-headed entity, Nyarlathotep, a shape-shifting messenger of the gods, Yog-Sothoth, a cosmic entity that exists in multiple dimensions, Shoggoths, amorphous shape-shifting blobs created by the elder things, and Azathoth, the blind, insatiable king of the outer gods. Digging deeply into Lovecraft's seemingly insatiable, cosmically lethal, and brutally disfigured monsters, I found that I had the perfect metaphor to get at the creature the mob became, and to depict the level of racial hatred that can only be defined by the nature of horror itself. And I quote from my play, which was and is to be performed by a young black woman and man, young black woman. But that night the monster was born, a creature with many mouths, young black man, many tongues darting in and out, putrid breath, mocking, stinking, a smirk just beneath its fleshy, worm-like lips. The irony here, of course, is that there is overwhelming evidence from H.P. Lovecraft's letters, poetry, and public fiction that he was a virulent and extreme racist. Scholars and contemporaries alike have noted that his prejudices and xenophobia were unusually vehement, even for his time. However, in recent years, black writers have borrowed and subverted his techniques to depict the horrors of racism in the South. One of the most popular recent examples of this is Lovecraft Country in 2020, which was written by Misha Green and produced by Get Out director and writer Jordan Peele. In that series, Green and Peele found the perfect metaphor for the cruelty, ugliness, and disgusting behavior that exuded from Jim Crow South. Typical Lovecraftian monsters are defined by their incomprehensible nature, alien indifference to humanity, and the sanity-breaking appearance rather than traditional motives like malice. They are often unseen, invisible, and present, and present the insignificance of humanity in a vast and uncaring universe. At their heart, however, they incorporate the darkness of human sensibility, our hidden motives, our secret evil, our most malignant and awful desires, revenge, murder, hatred, and bigotry. The true horror of Lovecraft's monsters originate not from physical violence, but from the psychological, intellectual breakdown of the protagonist. A glimpse of these creatures, or an understanding of their true cosmic nature, can shatter a person's sanity, and that is exactly what happened at that Stewart Bridge in Columbia, Missouri in 1923. The monster the mob created out of their own bodies was unknowable, incomprehensible, existing outside of our normal understanding of reality, time, and space. For example, some may inhabit angles of time rather than curves, and their actions defy human logic and physics. And here's the key to what happened in that moment. The awfulness of the creature is that it lived in the bodies and minds of students, the faculty, the shop owners, the police, the publishers, and the townspeople, in the immaterial dimensions of our personalities that exist in dimensions between the spaces we know. How could these ordinary people who jingle the change in their pockets, joke on the golf course, pick up their children after school, become a mob capable of pulling an innocent man out of his jail cell, where he's supposed to be safe from judgment until his day in court, and drag him screaming to a railroad bridge in broad daylight with everyone watching, tie a noose around his neck, and toss him off like he was a piece of garbage? In the play, the mob is egged on by the corrupting values of race, hatred, and fear in an almost ritualistic manner by the Columbia Tribune editor, Edward Watson, who exhorted his fellow citizens to give James Scott swift justice, wondering out loud for the masses, why waste time with a trial over a black man? Why squander community coffers? This itself was a common Lovecraftian plot device where a character's desire for dangerous knowledge or power leads to their own and others' downfall. And I played with the notion of a subtle dread, a banality to the horror, with a sense of impending inescapable doom, which is frequently more chilling than a clear-cut confrontation. As the crowd transformed into a menacing mob, I tried to borrow from Lovecraft's physically grotesque and multiple contradictory features, focusing its oozing, slimy, corpse-like texture, bordering on the gelatinous protean mass with a proliferation of tentacles, claws, and unblinking eyes that made the monster mob appear both predatory and alien. I also wanted the mob to feel like an undead thing with a repulsive stench and making shrieking, strange, unearthly noises, unable to control itself. The mob assembles itself grotesquely in order to complete its horrific task, yet all the components of the mob are made up of the ordinary, the banal, like shine shoes, iron shirts, and Mizzou students who stood there, composition books in their hands between classes, watching all this play out before their eyes. My hope in the play, as it moves to complete its awful task, was to reclaim and subvert Lovecraft's own racist tropes in order to expose the true real-world cosmic horror of systemic racism and marginalization, dismantling Lovecraft's bigoted foundations to build new narratives that explore Black identity and resistance within the genre of cosmic horror. In order to do so, I use the motif of monstrous transformation to represent race hatred, transmuting the banal acceptance of the crowd watching what they perhaps felt was a form of public entertainment into a descent into depravity as they participate fully in a brutally unjust murder. The horror comes not from the unknown, but from the lack of basic morality that allows an innocent Black man to be cruelly tossed over the side of a bridge, his neck in a noose. Because Lovecraft's narratives are preoccupied with the idea of dangerous outsiders, I tried to flip this script by portraying the Black characters as outsiders who are unjustly feared and persecuted by racist society. The real monster here is the oppressive social structure that alienates and brutalizes them. The existential dread, monstrous entities, and loss of sanity all result from a deeply embraced racism over which the mob has no will or ability to control. And again, I quote from a play that I wrote, Young Black Woman, "Do not think that all those people were in a trance. Do not think they did not know what they were doing. Their flesh slipped into one flesh. They embraced the Leviathan they were about to become." Young Black Man. "They were warned not to take justice into their hands. They were begged not to do this thing. Judge Henry A. Collier pleaded with them." Young Black Woman. "Men, do not kill him now. I will promise you a fair trial and swift justice if he is convicted." Young Black Man. Sheriff Brown faced the horror of his own failing, stated, Young Black Woman, "Is there a man here who will aid me in preserving law and order?" Young Black Man. "But there were no men there." Young Black Woman. "In their place was a beast. 2,000 eyes, 2,000 feet, 1,000 hungry mouths filled with teeth, and for its food it wanted human meat." As a white, cisgendered, straight male, it may not even be my place to have written this play, as this might be the work that must be done by an African-American playwright. And perhaps it's even more appropriate that I use Lovecraft's own language and technique to dig into the meat of this horror. However, my work as a dramatist is primarily to do what Edward Albee often said, to hold a mirror up to people and say, "Hey, this is you. If you don't like what you see, why don't you change?"
Morning, all. Thank you for being with me in this talk. It's dense and sprawling all at once, and a little bit rough towards the end, but it's the beginning of a new thought for me. I'll approach our topic on nourishment today through the vampire. I value the vampire as a kind of cartographer of ungrievability, teaching us to see the places where people will feel least likely to be missed or valued. We could think of films like Vampires vs. the Bronx, Black as Night, The Invitation, Now Sinners, where vampires prey on vulnerable populations, often in racialized and lower income spaces that divide the dominant group from the marginalized group. This is an important narrative, but my talk is interested in thinking about forms of disposability that are not only inflicted by dominant groups, but also created, eroticized, and fantasized about within marginalized communities, which today I locate in queer nightlife. I'll be tracing this question through queer vampire fiction to consider how Black and queer writers grapple with two competing impulses: communal or mutualistic appetites, which reimagine vampirism as kinship, care, and ethical relation among queer subjects, and antisocial, communal, impersonal appetites, which eroticize anonymity, danger, power, and disposability. The first half examines works that frame queer vampires in positive ways, that offer marginalized readers a sense of belonging, love, and an egalitarian vision of community. And then I'll turn to texts that resist this imperative, bless you, towards representation, positive representation, by presenting desires that are more dangerous and personal and fetishizing, enclosing those that eroticize being drained and discarded in ways that map onto race. And throughout, I'm interested in how these vampire stories reveal conflicted appetites at the heart of queer subcultures that put a strain on narratives of shared longing and belonging. And I'll begin with Jewel Gomez because she represents an ethical vampire ideal who can evidence those communal investments that I'll sort of turn on their head at the end of the talk. In her seminal study of vampires fiction, Our Vampires Ourselves, Nina Auerbach traces the history of vampire representation from the mid-1800s onwards, concluding that vampires of the 1980s have become, in a now familiar pun, defanged. For Auerbach, this defanging registers her disappointment that vampires have lost their outsider appeal as revolutionary subjects for having joined communities governed by rules, morals, kinship structures that lead them to rein in once violent and unruly appetites. One of the key offenders of this allegedly self-righteous decade, she calls it, is Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories, a 1991 novel about a Black lesbian vampire building a multiracial community. Auerbach pronounces Gilda and her kind defanged for having learned identity politics, which turn vampirism, she argues, into a joyless and clannish model of collective constraint, her terms. It's a wonderful novel, and I'm only going to pull out those points that show moments where Gilda is reshaping vampirism from something which only satiates the vampire to something which is also nourishing and helpful to those she feeds upon. In her essay, Recasting the Mythology, Gomez herself names the Gilda Stories as representing a search for community. It is also an effort to ameliorate the concerns of her community. Gomez recalls how a fellow Black lesbian feminist friend worried that connecting lesbianism with vampirism would be, quote, negative and destructive. The Gilda Stories represents Gomez's proof, in her words, that she could create a mythology to express who I am as a Black lesbian feminist and what I want. The Gilda Stories begins with Gilda's escape from slavery in 1850 and ends with her flight from vampire hunters in 2050. Throughout, she builds an ethical vampire community based in queer of color feminisms. The novel reframes vampirism from predation by valorizing a feeding practice that vampires call the exchange, where vampires leave those that they drink from with dreams that compels them to pursue healthier, happier lives. Good vampires closely read the minds of others in order to reinforce good ways of thinking and desiring from those they drink from. The bite of her vampires does not then unleash the excessive and unrepressed acts of deviance familiar to Gothic fiction, but helps fashion right desiring subjects who are better able to moderate their desires. They present themselves as having a beneficial relationship to their victims that can, as one vampire advises, feel what they are needing, not what you are hungering for. You leave them with something new and fresh, something wanted. This is the only way to share, not to rob. So again, leave them with a dream that can inspire them. This symbiotic way of discerning and caring about the other is contrasted with white slave-holding supremacist modes of consumption critiqued by Gilda's mother. They just barely human. They suck up the world, don't taste it, she says. Rather than consuming indiscriminately and selfishly, good vampirism demands discernment and mutuality. In so doing, it distinguishes itself from the villainous vampires in the book, those of our kind who kill for exhilaration, those, she writes, who burn like small fires, waiting to engulf, to consume whatever comes near them. In a fiction that's thinking about the logics of colonialism, captivity, and in the end, climate change, these improper modes of consumption are linked to threats that not only that we pose to one another, but also to the planet. They represent what Gomez later calls the air of disposability that threatens all living things. And thanks to the ethical work that her vampires perform, it is not only her characters, but readers who might also be propelled towards healthier, more sustaining, and more altruistic modes of desiring. The vampire community from Gomez's novel is at home in a larger array of altruistic queer vampire communities that sprung up in literature in 1991. This includes the white, lesbian, and gay vampires of John Peyton Cook's novel Out for Blood, or Eric Garber's queer horror anthology Embracing the Dark, which shrink antisocial drives in order to better lure queer readers in with a promise of lasting fellowship. As the editors herald, these stories signal something new in the ancient, musty mausoleums of horror fiction. Love and community can now be found among the moonlit shadows. Desires long stigmatized as evil, blasphemous, and ugly are finally being given their due, they write. The movement away from ugly desires requires a turn towards more positive portraits of community that can showcase families we choose, as when one vampire from the collection adopts a queer fledgling that he rescues from AIDS and sex work. Such vampires intervenes in the logics of disposability to take care of at-risk populations. Vampire anthologies follow suit by doing work of world building that Gilda performs in the novel. The earliest queer vampire anthology, Daughters of Darkness, 1993, acknowledges Gomez as igniting the hunger for this lesbian vampire public. The anthologies that follow in their wake, Dark Angels, 1993, Sons of Darkness, 1996, and Brothers of Night, 1997, all employ terms like daughters, sons, and brothers to gather queers into a found family around the taboo desires that brought them to the vampire. So there's this sort of celluloid closet quest for representation here, where queer subjects first report seeing themselves in vampire fiction and films as monsters and victims, in this sort of bury your gaze trope that interprets progress by moving away from those villains and tragic victim roles. So in vampire film and fiction, we might think of something like a celluloid coffin narrative of self-representation, where queer vampires unbury themselves from negative roles in order to have a better chance at queer love and community that was presented as doomed in vampire films by straight directors. And there's, of course, some nuance to this, especially within the queer men's anthologies, which often present the victim as a desirable erotic role. Brothers of Night teases the reader in its introduction to the anthology. The vampire comes to you with open arms, inviting you into his dark embrace, but brother, think twice. This is not a love story. The vampire craves your blood. Now, while we've seen how queer horror can grapple with positive desires for connection and community, the question is how to make room for representations of desire like these that do not crave mutuality, but objectification, disposability, sexual practices that are fleetingly transactional, superficial, and link danger to and desire and power. For this, we need to return to a key moment in the Gilda stories in 1970s New York. Here, a despairing Gilda finds herself heading to the popular men's cruising spots along the piers, seeking, Gomez writes, an aura of danger, the excitement and pain. Tonight was all, danger was all that would satisfy her. No, tonight was not a night of love, it was a night of feeding, Gomez writes. Feeding here marks a kind of despairing lapse in the ethics of relationality. Dressed as a man, Gilda's appetite for danger mirrors the risk-embracing men around her. The scene that she inhabits is defined by the bad appetites of male cruisers. The men at the piers engage in a mix of drug use, risky and paid sex that put them in contact with potentially fatal figures who have little regard for one another. No, they take instead their exhilaration from the very air of disposability, the aura of danger, of sucking down others without meaningfully engaging their lives. The alternative phrase that Gomez accusatory uses to describe the exchange, the trade, she calls it, is not present here in the cruiser's solipsistic pursuit of trade, which would reduce the other to a mere sex object. And so in the remainder of the talk, I'll turn to other fantasies that vampires might excite in their victims, their readers, when they let go the rehabilitating dreams that Gilda gives them. They let go dreams of egalitarianism, reciprocity, and shared personhood, and are more likely to eroticize risk and power in ways that are sometimes exclusionary and sometimes fetishizing. And so to be clear, my goal isn't to celebrate these desires, but to note how important it is that queer writers have access to vampirism as a way to explore these fraught kinds of desires in fictions that both like simulate and stimulate those sort of troubling modes of desire, I'll say. So while the Guild of Stories offers Black queer skeptics positive reflections in vampire fiction to ameliorate their concerns, there's an equally important politics in refusing to produce or seek queer community on these terms. And this especially matters with later writers who are contesting homonormativity. My thinking here comes from the challenge of queer theorists like Greg Goldberg's Queer Pleasure Without Apology, who notes the tendency for queers to have to, in his words, redescribe troubling sexual desires and pleasures as either benign or virtuous, to cleanse sex of its antisocial elements. By extension, a queer vampirism without apology would not expunge those antisocial elements, but use vampirism to explore appetites that express enthusiasm and uncertainty about the goodness of liking what one does. In that spirit, I'm now turning to works that refuse to use vampirism to exhibit that welcoming pull of community. We go from the mutually nourishing bite of the vampire to those that are thrilling for vampires, their victims, and their readers, for treating others as disposable in ways that are steeped in the erotic life of racism and power. And I just want to offer two examples of anthologies that resist that demand for positive representation. First, there's a lovely 2010 anthology, Zombieality, A Queer Bent on the Undead, which reports an immense amount of indignation that queer readers felt toward the idea of an anthology on zombies and queerness, that it was almost shut down at the level of publication. And I'm really grateful here for Steve Jones' writing on zombies and sexualities, where he discusses how zombies are figures who are forsaking the values and social bonds that define humanity. So they feel like a less apt vehicle for exploring queer desire that I think vampires have played around with differently. More recently, the editors of the 22 horror anthology Queer Saints recount what they describe as the bullying of queer writers by their own community, with one editor speaking back to her queer dissenters. Queer writers don't owe you squeaky clean characters or stories. They don't owe you the type of representation that we're routinely told is important and revolutionary. Such works insist upon the importance or pleasure of inhabiting the monstrous appetites that may feel irredeemable to the queer communities that they are imagined to represent. This matters especially because of how often the vampiric subgenre supports and often even requires the exploration of those sort of taboo-fraught desires. And so I want to show how within this communal context that sort of Auerbach dismiss, because there's still a lot of these anti-social tensions that don't produce vampires as rule-obeying subjects, but is in fact an unruly space of desire. Gay vampire fiction, cruising fictions, takes us to fraught points of contact in queer nightlife, where love and community doesn't feel possible in the shadows. For instance, even the benevolent, communally minded vampires of Out for Blood produce their own outsides when its white vampire protagonist fears being in predominantly Black spaces, or chooses to ignore a racial slur a white man uses on the dance floor because, the novel shrugs, he was used to the bigotry of native Chicagoans. No point in raising a stink about it and scaring away this hunk. In their pursuit of desire, such moments reveal the racial limits of vampiric cruising fictions and spaces, organized solely around same-sex desire. They turn our attention towards appetites that live in the shadows, exclusionary appetites for sameness, or desires that fetishize racial difference. In white gay fiction, like David Thomas Lord's Bound in Blood, The Erotic Journey of the Vampire, the vampire antihero is just such a cruiser, hunting his own, taking advantage of the anonymity, the interchangeability of gay bodies, all striving to match the same macho archetypes celebrated in gay nightlife. He's very much at home in the era of disposability. Some vampires may not see themselves in mirrors, but this white gay vampire sees the desirability of his own body reflected endlessly in those who strut to resemble him. Dressed in leather, he looks upon what the novel describes as a veritable cattle drive of fashion towards the Hudson River like lemmings. Masked by uniformity, he easily absorbed into the mass of humanity, this cow-covered kindred, the post-disco darlings, the flotsam and jetsam of human flesh and illicit substances. He is free to gorge himself unnoticed in this culture of same seeking same. He will find someone, anyone, just as he is, Lord writes. Such a novel is striking because it mocks the very narrow desires that its pornographic prose also seeks to excite in its readers. This drive towards uniformity makes the death of one of the few non-white hookups the vampire kills both terrible and telling. A black man he calls my Nubian prince. As the black man caresses the white vampire, he's aroused by the same generic white body. The novel says he explores yet another white boy, his passion and his obsession. Into this world of same seeking same, the black gay man reminds readers like me of my difference from the sexual world of this novel. It's an encounter where vampire and victim desire one another as racial fantasies, one which here proves fatal for the black victim. So wrapping up, what is the promise of bringing these representations together as a black queer cultural critic of horror? While it's possible to highlight texts by black queer men that extricate themselves from these problematic desires, I'm interested in how they use vampire stories to confront and inhabit these kind of obsessions. As early as Essex Hemphill's 1992 poetry, black gay men have used vampires to explore appetites that conflict with one's sense of self and safety. I'd also say racial pride. Another example is Craig Lawrence Gidney's short story, 2006 short story, Etiolate. I won't go into it for reasons of time. But because I begin with anthologies and collective storytelling, I'll close with a story by Guy Mark Foster, Some Kind of Vampirism it's called, which first appeared in the 1989 Black Gay Men's magazine, Pyramid Periodical. It is a story that uses vampirism not only to describe the racial fantasies that lead black and white men to consume one another, but also the racializing fantasy of black brotherhood that leaves its black narrator, to try to consume another black man like him. It is a kind of vampirism, yes, when the white man rambles in a dream about his wish to consume black men as soul food. I desire your soul, your greasy mahogany biscuit-flavored soul, he says. But it is also a kind of vampirism when the black man turns towards the black lover he calls his would-be warrior, unthawing the frost of my own tribal memories, and a tribesman sent to deliver me back. Right before he bites the black man's necks, he dreams of exotifying magazine images of Africans and the idea of eating a cola nut before biting the man whose African skin smeared red, the story says, as the man yells, "Damn, brother, what is your motherfucking..." The story here stages a tug between two competing understandings of belonging. Casting his lot with the white vampire world that has long rejected him, or seeking a return, an imagined return, to his racial homeland. But both are fantasies that turn racializing desire into a form of vampirism. It ends with a narrator returning to my beautiful translucent lover, who embraces him not consolingly, but as an eternal fixture. Their bond is forever. They continue to awaken, the story writes, each morning and consume one another's physical essences. I want to end here because this image complicates the nourishing ethics of Gilda's peers by using vampirism to inhabit the messy, contradictory, interracial and intraracial desires that animate queer nightlife. Rather than smoothing away these contradictions, vampirism exposes and even revels in fraught appetites that arise in the dark and whose tragedy might not be in the fact that they're fleeting, but how they seem to go on forever. Thank you.
So I'm a playwright, and I, among other things, I create site-specific theater and recently site-specific horror theater. And I just had a play close in DC that ran for 6 weeks at Congressional Cemetery in the small historic chapel called Mary Shelley's Monsters, which is a meta three-hander, Mary, the Creature, and Victor. And from early in pre-production and casting, we made the decision that we could not cast an actor of color as the creature. But after hearing what you said here, I'm like, first of all, white playwright, white director, I don't think we felt prepared to address what casting a creature as an actor of color would mean. So we cast Victor as a non-binary African-American wonderful actor. And his performance was great, but it also really didn't say much at all about race, which was kind of what we wanted. Do we have any examples of a creature who's a person of color that we don't know, that my team didn't know about? Yeah, from Frankenstein, a Frankenstein adaptation, a graphic novel, anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's like that link between race and monstrosity. For example, in Caliban, of course, from Tempest, and Grendel, also could be seen that way. But Elizabeth Young, who I cited, her book Black Frankenstein is really all about this, and that book was absolutely written against the context of those political debates that were happening in England, and Mary Shelley was, incredibly up to date and aware of those debates and discussions. And for that matter, Melville, in the writing of Moby Dick, it was a similar situation. You find race in that book represented in a certain way, and he too was in the midst of it. That book came out in 1851. He had also read Frankenstein and was responding to Frankenstein in his own way, in a different way. He sort of spun in a different direction. But I want to make another comment, which was not the question you asked, and then I'll pass it on to see what these guys have to say. But it is the question of Mary Shelley herself as Monstrous. I mean, she was considered mentally unwell for writing this story in the first place. She was also, traveling around with a married man, unmarried. She, after he died, did not remarry. She traveled around Europe unchaperoned. I mean, this is when Jane Austen was writing her, the practically contemporaries. So she was completely like a gender warrior, and considered to be mad herself. She wasn't just traveling around Europe unchaperoned, she was also writing about it and publishing about it. So people thought she was a complete scandal, not the least of which because she wrote this incredibly horrific book that people thought was diseased, and they thought that she was diseased for writing it.
Thank you.
I've been drafting a book called Walking Away from Frankenstein, which is looking at the use that Frankenstein has to queer of color communities, particularly Black queer communities on the margins. And so a couple things come up for me. One, there's a book, Chicano Frankenstein, which is that reimagining, if you're interested in that more directly. I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep close to my chest just because it's an out of print book that I don't want to be scooped on. But there's a Black gay playwright and novelist who wrote an adaptation of a Frankenstein story in which the monsters pieced together from body parts of the enslaved. And so there is a really fascinating history of this in terms of the kind of representations in which inhabiting the creature is really affirming. But to go back to what you said about resemblance that I'm so interested in, and the way that Elizabeth Young approaches it, like in a film like Blackenstein, which is, it's just a bad film. But
I haven't seen it yet, but it's on my list.
But one of the interesting things about the way that race shows up in that to the topic of resemblance is you have, say, the comedian Dick Gregory, and Elizabeth Young talks about this, saying, as many marginalized communities do, I saw myself in that creature, I saw myself as othered in it, and in fact, I feel a kind of kinship and family with you. And so what's interesting about a film like Blackenstein, the possibility and the disappointment of it, is that it sets up a creature who feels poised to be a kind of liberator to and of Black folks, but then ultimately ends up killing Black communities in ways that are disappointing to a lot of those readers. I'd also say, lastly, Victor Lavelle's graphic novel, The Destroyer, is a direct continuation of the Frankenstein story, but it has that similar question, I'll just leave off on that, of what is, if a community recognizes and identifies with a creature such as the Frankenstein monster, does that creature owe that community a kind of fellowship or like a kind of a requirement to act as a representative of those people? And so I think it's a really interesting set of representations we're getting now, where there are lots of people who are like, yeah, this is a creature that I connect with. In fact, I want to cast the creature as a person of color or whatever it might be, or queer. But how does that creature behave when so much of that story is about, establishing a claim to oneself, I think, that sometimes operates independently of those projections. Yeah, sorry, that was a ramble.
And then to add one more thing to that, of course, is that Susan Stryker positions the creature as a trans body, medicalized trans body, including the creation of the bride in Scotland. He goes up to Scotland to do it. I'm not sure why, but that's more explicitly described, actually, than the creation of the original creature in the novel.
Hi, my question is primarily for David Crespy. In your talk, you mentioned that what you are reflecting on a lot in your writing as a straight cis white man who is kind of writing characters of color in sort of a Lovecraftian style way. I found it really interesting that you reflected on Lovecraft Country as kind of one of your influences for that. And
Well, it wasn't. It came
Okay.
after I wrote it.
Okay.
It's
sorry.
in looking back that I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. We both kind of hit on the same thing, but it was not an influence.
Oh, okay. I misheard. My apologies.
That's all right. No.
What my question was more in coming up with that topic was you mentioned this idea of Black creators kind of reclaiming that cosmic horror or kind of reclaiming that space from Lovecraft. While the Lovecraft Country show was primarily Black creators, the author of Lovecraft Country was originally a white man. So I'm wondering if maybe in your studying and in your research, what authors of color have you either have influenced your work or kind of influenced your line of thinking, or even just that you all three of you, of course, find interesting. I guess the meat of my question is what authors of color reclaiming that, for lack of a better term, Lovecraftian space do you all enjoy or do you all reflect upon in your practice?
So, just from my own personal experience, I'm primarily an Edward Albee scholar, and so because of that, and I've actually just published an article about this, I connected heavily with Adrienne Kennedy, who wrote Funny House of a Negro, which is a horror play. It's a nightmare drama, and also because I have written extensively on the use of dreaming and dream content and form. And Adrienne Kennedy wrote very specifically from her own dreams to create that. So she's the biggest influence on me in terms of horror. I actually directed Funny House of a Negro. Adrienne is, I think, 94, 95 at this point. She had her Broadway debut at 92. It took her that long to be produced on Broadway. But if there's anyone who influenced me, it was her. And she's influenced all of my writing a lot of ways. I mean, both her and Edward. She was one of Edward's many proteges. She had a particularly problematic relationship with Edward, which I've written about. She actually wrote an essay called Visited by a Phantom about Edward Albee, which is published in The Dramatist, which you can look up. And it's a beautiful kind of prose poem about this rather bizarre experience she had writing Funny House of a Negro, working with Edward Albee. But she is primarily the primary influence on exploring the nightmarish world, and also in a highly non-linear, dreamlike, oniric technique.
Oh, sorry.
I'm excited about that question. Sorry. Yeah, even to return to Victor Laval, if you look at the Ballad of Black Tom is like one novella. where specifically, which like draws upon Frankenstein as well, but which draws upon the sense of what is indifference against the hatred I am exposed to as a Black man. And so I'm really interested in the kind of fictions that get told around that, because on one hand, there's a really lovely poetry collection, Tentacles Longer Than Night, by a Black queer Caribbean poet and designer, which is specifically having Lovecraftian gods who are coming down to particularly like Black hip hop artists and such, saying like, wow, we see you, we hear your music. Actually, how could you feel insignificant? Your shit is so good, you know? But it's essentially, there's a really lovely array of, just one last thing to switch here, of Black creators. P.J. Clark's Ring Shout also has a lot of that weird imagery. But I'm also really fascinated with the work that, Harlem's Unbound is another recommendation I'll give, which is for people who play Call of Cthulhu. That's a specific campaign that's written in the world of the Harlem Renaissance. So you're interacting with folks like Langston Hughes or Neil Hurston, but solving a Lovecraft mystery. But finally, I was gonna say, last point, I love even the Shoggoth, because I know that it represents even in the way it shows up in Lovecraft country, that sort of amorphous blob that so lends itself to thinking about the experience that you lovely encapture of like what it means for humans to be transformed into that. It's also a figure that is like a form of racialized labor in the Lovecraftian mythos that sort of builds the temples of these white mythic figures. And so it's interesting, there is a short story, I can't remember the name, by a white author, where there's about a Black jazz man who sort of befriends and becomes obsessed with the Shoggoths at a level of racial identification. There's another book you might check out called, I think, Zora Neale Hurston versus the Cosmos, where Zora Neale Hurston's fighting Lovecraftian gods, also written by a white man. But I think in that regard, it's really cool. Like I don't really I understand the importance of looking at the work Black creators are doing in the genre. I'm also think, especially because, you know, Lovecraft's racism is the emergence of a white mind. It feels important for white people to do that work too. So I'm grateful for that there's a play that's also exploring that. Sorry, that was a lot.
Thank you, all three of you. Amazing presentations. Thank you for breathing new life into Frankenstein. I get tired of teaching it, but new ideas always coming in. And I have some questions for you later, but complicated stuff. But Brandon, I'm curious, you're a teacher, right? You're an assistant professor right now. Do you use any of this material with your students in the classroom? And if you do, to what end? Right? Are they writing creative? Are they writing scholarship? I'm just sort of curious how you sort of bridge what you're doing in the research with your teaching.
Yeah, no, I thank you for that question. For this, the last paper is always a creative paper that they're allowed to explore. So it takes different forms. Like one of the things I love, like I'm teaching a class right now on Blackness and Vampires. And one of the things I love to do is introduce sort of kooky, bad films people have felt like Fright Night 2 and Grace Jones' Vamp and things like that. And to look at the significance of what it means to think with and live with these characters that are important for Black representation, but in this case don't have any voice in those particular texts. And so students find their own narrative forms that they find important to perform this kind of work. Like for instance, students will write memoirs in the form of the vampire that is sort of unpacking, as if encountering characters across time, the different people they meet throughout the course of the semester. I teach a class in Blackness and Horror, which has a section called All Lives Splatter, and is looking at the racial logics of death in the horror film, and the kind of projects like students come up with. Like I've had students like design like haunted walks, like ghost walks, and thinking about how do you script the kind of people who can die or who are killed within these. So it's basically, I'll conclude there. They always have the option of approaching a standard academic paper, which is always the first paper. But the second one leaves room for the different kind of projects that are relevant to them. Like students have written How to Survive a Zombie Apocalypse Guide that is once again working through how race shows up in the zombie apocalypse. And it always I'm always blown away at the end of the semester. Like I've actually teared up several times while reading their work, just because I'm like, y'all, when we let you out of this box, like the shit you produce, you know? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually we do some similar things together.
and I'm kind of, the reason why I'm asking, I'm sort of trying to navigate this in my head. So I teach primarily film now, right? And film seems to be pretty easily consumed by the students, right? So we look at a lot of scholarship, but a lot of the material you're looking at is a bit wilder. I think we could probably throw that in there. And trying to sort of dovetail these things in with their sort of creative projects, right? Trying to navigate something sort of that complicated in a diverse classroom, right? With people coming in from different backgrounds. Do you run into sort of any walls with them when they're encountering the material?
Yeah, that's always the most fun part. I don't teach any of the like more deeply pornographic fiction or anything like that. Like, I mean, erotics do show up in a lot of the texts that I teach, but I think a lot of the resistance they sometimes have is towards, how do I put it? Towards, there's often, in horror studies say, there's often a sort of valorization or insistence upon creating a kind of shared safe space. And a lot of my work is in troubling how safety and recreational pleasure come together. And so the ability to look at scenes or representations where it's like, yeah, this black character dies, but like, is this, I don't know, is that all there is to discuss in that moment? Or can the position of a black person dying a like enjoyable, funny, splat stick death be entertaining? Like I think they run into those problems even while looking at films. For novels, I'd say they're great readers. Like I'm surprised. I think if you, especially in film stacked classes, they're actually really happy to get their hands on a book, and it lets us chew into, I think, things in a neater way. Sorry, I'm not sure I answered that.
No, you did, right? Yeah, no, thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm really caffeinated today.
Thank you. I'm also a little over-caffeinated, and this might be a rambly question, but thank you so much all for sharing. And I wanted to ask if you could speak to the role of sort of like a climate fiction approach in maybe all the different types of works you spoke about. One thing that fascinates me about Frankenstein and a lot of works of vampire fiction is kind of the role of the ocean and the sea, and how in like my own creative and academic work, I want to explore how these monstrous figures can be used to talk about our relationship to the natural world. And I heard you mention Melville. I've never read Moby Dick, which is horrible, but some other titles you all might recommend relating to like monsters and the ocean.
Well, Frankenstein is climate fiction in a sense, since it was written in the year where there was no summer. So that was the backdrop against which she wrote. And she was also writing as a romantic, about this, there's so much landscape in that book. He really does, really does do a lot of hiking, Victor, including when he's supposed to build the bride. He's already been threatened with death by the monster, and he decides it's a really good time for a 5-month trip to England, during which they hike through the lake country. They stop in Edinburgh for a while. I mean, they really have those two, they have a really great time. And then he heads out to the Northern Islands, like far out into the North Sea, to create this, to create the bride. That's the second time he falls asleep at the bottom of a boat, is when he's fleeing. He does pause long enough to clean his instruments after he's destroyed the body of the bride. He needs to sterilize his instruments. So he spends, I think, a week doing that. At any rate, the open sea, the 2 times he falls asleep on open water, one is in a river, he's floating down the river in Germany or Switzerland, I forget where, and the other is when he leaves the Northern Islands and he drifts astray. So, and each of those journeys ends in disaster. He does not achieve that kind of romantic ideal of, being adrift on the open water and having some kind of beautiful vision, In the first, he arrives to find out that his brother has been murdered, and in the second, when his boat drifts ashore, it somehow, coincidentally, drifts ashore in Northern Ireland to the very town where Henry Clerval has been staying and has just been found in his bed murdered with bruise marks around his neck, murdered in bed. So That's why I said queering Frankenstein is not difficult. He is arrested for the murder and spends months in jail in that part of the book. So you have this sort of anti-ideal. I mean, you have the desire of the author to reach towards that romantic engagement with nature, but it's actually dangerous in the book. Every time he goes out into nature to try to have that sort of false, divided relationship with it, that was kind of the classic of the romantic ideal, he ends up in what Joy L. McSweeney calls the necropastoral, which is that inside the pastoral is death, always death. And that's what kind of haunts him and curses him. And so Melville gives full flowering to that, of course, in Moby Dick. That is also a book about monstrosity, not only the monstrosity of the external, which is the whale, but also the monstrosity of the human. In fact, Starbuck accuses he says to Ahab, this is blasphemous that you're assigning human qualities to a beast, And of course, that debate is inherent in the debate about slavery. Are African people actually human? And in England, even the most liberal people in England, some of them were against emancipation because they said, of course, African people should be treated humanely, but they don't have the intellect to be able to live free. They have to be taken care of. There's like this paternalistic liberalism around, so the category between man and beast gets blurred. And then, of course, Melville quite radically is taking the men of color, Queequeg, Tashtego, and Dagu, who are the Pacific Islander, North American indigenous, and African harpooners, plus the Farsi guy, who's a little more villainous, but they're the most powerful. The people of color in Moby Dick are the most powerful people. And that was a kind of like radical inversion as well. So there's a lot going on in both of those stories, and if you haven't read Moby Dick yet, you've just got to go on your list. Yeah.
There's a couple of things. There's a collection of eco vampires by Simon Bacon, or an essay. He's an interesting writer. But just to because I know you're interested in vampires, the Gilded Stories would be a great one, I think, to check out for that last chapter especially. I just finished giving a talk, which I'm trying to now publish the piece if anyone's interested, on Black botanical horror and plant horror. And so I think that within the realm of the eco-Gothic or in plant horror studies, that's been a really ripe realm for thinking about the pleasures of collapse, I think, of dreaming of a world that returns to that, vegetative state. And a lot of the work I do in looking at the sort of rehabilitative pleasure of trees that are so rooted in a memory of lynching, and being able to look at a subgenre that assigns and locates agency in trees, being able to outgrow those uses and to become terrifying to settlers. On the topic of oceans, lastly, it's not horror monsters as we think of them, but there's a really lovely poetry collection called Capable Little Monsters, which is a Black queer poet who's thinking about his desiring life entirely using Pokemon in the Pokedex. And so thinking about the space of oceanic creatures there. But the anecdote I want to end on is with Jaws, because I am trying to draft a piece on the ocean at some point. Too many essays. Too many dreams of essays. But in Jaws, it's such an interesting one, because in the book, for those who've read the book, there's the phobia of a shark that's terrorizing a local tourist protected white enclosed town is in fact preceded by the fear of a Black rapist who's imagined to be just, and the whole town's like, we have to keep this quiet. We don't want to upset our working population of Blacks who come in here, work in Amity, then leave, but we have to get this Black rapist story under control. And so you see that the whole fear of covering up the shark is actually preceded by the fear of Black male sexualities. And it's interesting in that way to think of Victor Lavelle, again, another important figure here, like in The Devil of Silver, he is thinking about Jaws for that reason. But when you think of the writer who wrote Jaws becoming a shark activist, and thinking of what it means to have produced a damaging representation that ends up contributing to the deaths of a group of life, and you think of the fact of how much Jaws is interyoked with blackness, right? There was an interesting story there. So yeah, I just say I really love that question. I think there's so much really lovely work in eco horror being done right now.